Okay, today we are learning Shabbat, Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to start at the very bottom of Yud Amud Bet. And today's shir is sponsored by Debbie Schreiber in memory of her aunt, Sima Bat Alter Avraham Berachel. Okay, we are on Daf Yud Amud Bet at the very bottom. We were starting with the issue of stone. So if you remember, we talked about, we were in the middle of a whole bunch of statements that Rava Bar Machasya said in the name of Rav Chama Bar Guri and the name of Rav. And the last one we were up to was that he said that you should move to a city that's been around for the least amount of time, because if it's been around for the least amount of time, there's less likelihood of people having sinned for a long time. And if people don't sin for a long time, then God won't punish them, basically, right? God punishes a city, and this is why obviously we end up getting to Stone, because Stone is the city where people were evil and the city got destroyed because people were not behaving properly. So what do we end up with? We end up with that you should move to the city because it's been around for less time. So they say, how do we know this? From Tzoar, the city of Tzoar, when Lot was running away, the angel said to him, go run to the mountains where Abraham is. And he said, no, I'm going to run to the city Tzoar because they've been around for less time than Stone. How many years less? Interesting, it's only 1 year of difference. It was 1 year, okay, because they say, Imalat na is 51, and Stone was 52 years old. Okay, now we're going to get to the years of Stone and how we know Stone was 52. So it says here, Vishalvata. Okay, Shalvata is that they were in a state of rest for how many years? Kafvav, 26 out of their 52 years. Dichtiv, 12 shana avdu et kedar la'omer, u13 shana maradu. Ubar-14 shana, and then it continues to say, and after 14 years, then there was the big war, and then Stone won from the war. So now we have this situation where they were struggling for 26 years, and only after that did they win the war, and then things were calm. Now, what does this show you? It shows you that when things are calm, that's when the trouble starts. Stone, when everything was calm and Stone and peaceful, that's when they became arrogant. And this goes back to a theme we've seen a lot of times already about the arrogance and about how arrogance leads to all sorts of sinning. And in Stone, people were sinning, and that's why, because things were calm, that caused the arrogance. I just want to go back for 1 minute to this issue of where you should move, what kind of town you should move to, and the city sinning. So the Meiri says that what we're talking about here is if you have no choice and you have to live in a city, and that's why really they mentioned Lot and Stone, normally you should really choose to live in a city where people aren't sinning and you have good people in the city. But if you have no choice, then you should, if you're going to choose between cities, this is an interesting way to choose where you live, well, choose the city that's been around the least amount of time if you already have no choice and you have to move in with sinners. Okay, next line of Rava Bar Machasya, we still have a number of issues that statements that Rava Bar Machasya brings up before we end up going back to our original Mishnah. Amar Rava Bar Machasya, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guri, Amar Rav, Kol ir shegagoteha gavohim mi beit hakneset l'sof charva. Okay, this sounds like a totally unrelated issue, but we're going to see that it actually is related. So it says here, if you have a city where all the roofs are taller than the shul, or in general, there's roofs taller than the shul, in the end, that city will be destroyed. Again, what's the issue here? The issue is that we have a city where people are arrogant. If you say, I'm going to build the biggest house in the town and it's going to be nicer than the synagogue, well, that again is leading to arrogance. So therefore, that city will ultimately be destroyed. Shene'amar, and they quote a pasuk from Ezra, L'romem et beit Eloheinu u'la'amid et charvotav. Okay, which is, right, that you should to raise up the house of God and to la'amid et charvotav. Then what's really important is the continuation. The pasuk says, "V'latet lanu gader b'Yehuda v'Yerushalayim." Okay, which means we're going to give it a Yehuda and Yerushalayim will be fenced off, meaning protected. Your city will be protected if you raise up the house of God. V'hanemile babatim. Then they point out, by the way, this doesn't obviously relate to towers in the city or big buildings. In other words, when you need office buildings, let's say. So that's okay that can be taller than the shul. What we're talking here is about personal, private homes. Okay, so that you shouldn't think that you're greater than the shul, that your house should be taller than the synagogue. Okay, here comes the Rav Ashi. Amar Rav Ashi, Ana Avdala Mata Machasya. I was the one who's personally responsible for the fact that Mata Machasya did not become destroyed. What was he? It sounds like his job was the guy in the Iriyah who makes sure that nobody builds taller than they're allowed to build. So he was in charge, and he basically said, I made sure that in Mata Machasya nobody built any higher than they were allowed to, and because of that, I saved the city. Well, interestingly, that he says that, it's funny because he's almost sounding a little bit arrogant, and the Gemara is almost going to put him in his place and says, what do you mean? The Ha-Charva, Mata Machasya was actually destroyed. So how could you say you were responsible that Mata Machasya wasn't destroyed when in fact it was destroyed? So the Gemara answers, Me'oto avol no charva. It happened to have gotten destroyed in the end, but it wasn't because of that reason. It was destroyed for other reasons. And that absolves Rav Ashi. But it is interesting that he seems to take this arrogant approach to kind of saying, oh, I was personally responsible. And in fact, they try to knock him down a little. Okay, continuing on with more statements of Rav Bar Machasya. This is, by the way, very common in the Gemara, that they quote something in somebody's name, or in this case, it's somebody who quoted somebody else who quoted the third person, and we keep going over different things where we're kind of collecting a bunch of things that he personally said. This is a very strange halacha, by the way, or not halacha, but statement. You're better off living underneath a Yishmael, okay, someone from Yishmael's family, v'lo tachat nochri, and not under the Romans, okay, because the Romans were known to be pretty bad. Tachat nochri v'lo tachat chabar. Well, if you're going to take your choice, Romans aren't even the worst. The worst is to be under the Persians, okay, and here chabar is also used often as a Persian sorcerer. Tachat chabar, okay, maybe we could understand this. But now we're going to say something very odd, which is better to live. Now, by the way, what does this mean to live under them? It means that they're ruling over you. Okay, so if you're under their rule, theoretically, it seems like they're talking about if you're working in somebody's house. Okay, so if you have to work as a slave, don't work, better off working for those people and not those people. Tachat chabar v'lo tachat tamich chacham. Now, this is a very strange one. It's better to be under a Persian sorcerer than to be working for a tamich chacham. And then it goes on to say, Tachat tamich chacham v'lo tachat yatom v'almana. Better to be with a tamich chacham rather than an orphan or a widow. Now, this is very odd. You would think it's a good thing to work for an orphan or a widow, and it's also a good thing to work for a tamich chacham. So I try to say here, just one second, someone's writing me. I want to make sure there's no problem here. Okay, so now the issue is that if you're tachat tamich chacham, then what's the issue? The issue is that you're going to end up in trouble because if you're under a tamich chacham, then you have to be very careful how you behave. And if you don't behave appropriately, then you're going to end up getting punished. And who's going to punish you? God's going to punish you because God is kind of protects the Talmidei Chachamim. And the next thing you have to worry about, worse than Talmidei Chachamim, God protects Yatomim and Almanot, orphans and widows. And therefore, if you make a mistake or you're not careful with how you treat them, then you're going to end up getting punished. So here we're saying, even though one would think better to live under a Talmid Chacham or a Yatom v'Almana, the more so they need your help, it's actually worse. So this sounds very odd. Wouldn't we think that we want to protect these people and we want good people working for them? So again, I think this is the rabbi's way of warning you, not really saying you shouldn't work for them, but saying that these people, if you're working for them, you need to be super, super, super careful and treat them well and behave appropriately, because otherwise God is kind of with them and going to end up punishing you directly. Okay. Continuing with Rav Bar Machasya. Amar Rav Bar Machasya, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rav, Kol choli v'lo choli me'ayin, Kol ke'ev v'lo ke'ev lev, Kol michush v'lo michush rosh. Okay, we're all in our minds right now is all about disease and disease spreading, and that's what we're thinking about. And in fact, the Gemara right now talks about this. Better to have any disease other than choli me'ayim. That is the worst, okay? If we talk about today, if you're sick, right, everybody's thinking the absolute worst. If you have corona, that's the worst. This is what the Gemara is saying. The worst thing right now is to have choli me'ayim. Or if you have any pain, the worst kind of pain is heart pain. Kol michush, any kind of issue, we're going from sickness to pain to kind of something a little bit less than that. And the worst is a headache of that category. And here comes the big one, kol ra'ah v'lo isha ra'ah. Okay, we moved out of sickness and disease, and now we're moving into, marry anyone, but don't marry a bad woman. Okay, now this sounds a little bit odd, and what are we talking about? First of all, I think the Gemara is making a comment about how to choose a wife. Now, in general, the main thing people liked was yichus, right? All about who's the family, and that's the most important thing. And the Gemara here is kind of telling you, no, it's not about yichus, it's about the woman's midot. And go look for a woman who has the proper midot. That's what's most important. Okay, the Amar Rav Bar Machasi, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guri, Amar Rav. Im yihiyu kol hayamim dio v'agamim kulmasim. If all the waters are filled with ink, okay, this is like Alana Kirshan's book. If all the seas were ink, okay, this is where it comes from, and all the agamim were kulmasim, and all the lakes were full of quills. V'shamayim yiriot, and the heavens were things to write on. V'chol, I think that's what the yiriot means here. V'chol b'nei adam lav larim, and everybody was a sofer. Everybody could write. Ein maspikim. Now you would think we're going to say, we couldn't possibly. It sounds like nishmat, right? And all the praises of God, but that's not what they say. Ein maspikim l'chtov halala shel reshut. We wouldn't be able to write up everything about governments, okay, and about the way rulers rule. So what are they talking about here? First of all, they say, Maikra, what's the pasuk? Amarav Mashar shir shamayim larum ve'eretz laomet v'lev melachim ein cheker. Okay, the heavens are the vastness and the height of the heavens and the depths of the land and the hearts of kings. Now, heart always means brain. That's the way they call the chacham lev. The hearts of brains, ein cheker. No one could ever really figure out, no one would ever understand these things. So we're basically putting the kings in the same category as the world, right? It's something that we can't possibly understand. Now, some people understand this in a positive way, and some people understand it in a negative way. Some people say that, what does this mean? This means that, okay, and we all know this, everybody's critical always of government and politicians. Don't be critical until you get into their position. You don't know what it's like, and will never properly understand all the issues and the factors that go into the making their decisions. And it's something important to keep in mind. Some people say it's a little bit more in a negative sense, but it seemed like Al Titvada la Rashut in Pirkei Avot, it says how the authorities are always considered negative, and maybe you shouldn't try to understand them because you should stay away from them. So there's different ways, but it seems to me like the pshat is don't be critical of them until you're in their position. You don't really understand what's taken into consideration. Some people say this is why we also have to pray l'shlom malchut, because they need help. They don't even know exactly what they're doing. It's another thing, right? Even it's very hard for them to make decisions, as we all know, right? We all love to be critical, but nobody knows what they would do if we were in their position. Okay, continuing on. V'amar Rav bar Machasya, amar Rav Chama bar Guria, amar Rav, yafet ta'anit lechalom ke'esh le'ne'oret. A fast for when you have a bad dream, okay, we're back to the bad dream thing. A fast for a bad dream is like eish le'ne'oret, is like fire that destroys the bad part. Like you put a fire in to singe the parts of think of the cloth we're talking about here that you don't want, or the flax. It basically gets rid of any part of your bad dream. Here we're going to get back to Shabbat. Amar Rav Chisda ubo bayom. First of all, the dream is very successful when you do it at the day that you have the dream. That's when you have to fast. But Amar Rav Yosef afilu b'Shabbat. He says even on Shabbat, even though you would think we're not allowed to fast on Shabbat. We have to enjoy our Shabbat. But what's the issue here? If you had a really bad dream, your enjoyment of Shabbat will be destroyed because you'll be very distracted all Shabbat thinking about your bad dream. And therefore, even on Shabbat, you're allowed to fast because, right, we have conflicting interests. Oneg Shabbat on the one hand is eating, but Oneg Shabbat is also feeling like you're doing something to get rid of that bad dream and get it off your head. Now we're going to have a story about this. Rabbi Yeshua Bered Rav Idi Ikla Lebe Rav Ashi. He came to Rav Ashi's house. Avdele Igla Tilta. He made him the best kind of meat. It's like the best cut of meat. It's all different interpretations about what it is. Is it a 3-year-old egel, it's something with 3, because tilta is 3. Is it the egel that was born third to its mother? The first 2 there's an assumption that they weren't so healthy, but the third always comes out the healthiest. And another is that it got to a third of its growth in terms of age. So Amrle litomar midi, and whatever it is, he brings him something very worthy, and he says, eat something. Amar lahu b'ta'anit yativna, I'm actually fasting today. Amrule v'lo savarle mar lahad Rav Yehuda da'amal Rav Yehuda. Don't you hold like Rav Yehuda? Now this is classic, right? You're vegetarian, and someone says to you, but look, the meat's so good. Why don't you just eat it? So he says, but don't you know what Rav Yehuda says? Loveh adam ta'anito porea. You can basically put a loan out on your fast, and you can pay back a different day. In other words, there's good food in front of you today. Don't miss your fast today. Don't miss your food today. Go push off your fast till tomorrow. Amarle ta'anit chalomu. He says, this wasn't just a regular ta'anit. I'm fasting today because I had a really bad dream. And now he quotes, in this quote, our Rav Bar Machasya. Amar Bar Machasya, Amar Rav Chana Bar Goria, Amar Rav, Yafet ta'anit l'chalom ke'esh l'ne'ored. And look what he says. He says, this is how I'm going to, have a good day, by getting rid of my bad dream. Amar Rav Chisda, ubo bayom. And Rav Chisda said, and then he continues to say, it has to be on this day. I can't push off my fast. And Rav Yosef said about this, afilu b'Shabbat. So you see, I really can't eat, but thank you anyway. Okay, we're finally finished with Rav Bar Machasya. Now we're moving back to our original Mishnah. Remember it said, you're not allowed to do any of the following actions, sit down for a haircut or all these other things, when it's samuch lemincha. But if you started already, mafsikin. And then it says at the end of the Mishnah, mafsikin l'kriyat shema ve'em mafsikin l'tfilah. Now this is a little bit strange. We understand mafsikin l'kriyat shema, but then it also says em mafsikin l'tfilah. Now em mafsikin l'tfilah, we already said that's how the Mishnah started out. You don't stop for davening. So hatan le'reisha, doesn't it already say that before? Em mafsikin. So the answer is seifa atan l'divrei Torah. The seif is coming to tell you specifically about divrei Torah, that if you're learning, you don't need to stop to daven. Now, this is very odd. This seems to imply even if you're going to miss the time for davening, if you're learning, you don't actually need to stop. Ditanya, as it says in the following Braita, Chaverim shahayu oskim b'Torah, mafsikin l'kriyat shema ve'em mafsikin l'tfilah. They need to stop for kriyat shema. They don't need to stop to daven. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan now comes in and says, wait a minute. Lo shanu ela kigom Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. This is not everybody. This is someone like Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, v'chaverav and his friends, shetoratan omanutan. Okay, that their Torah is their job. This is all they do all day. Now, you might think if you do that all day, you could stop for prayer. But no, these people were in a special category that their learning was so important that they were able to not actually daven. This is obviously a bit of a dangerous statement because, right, if you fall into this category, then all sorts of things could happen. For example, you could have people saying, right, like nowadays, right, we have this whole issue with Haredim who are not stopping their schools while everybody else in the country is because they feel like their learning is so important. Now, okay, we'll put them in their place in a minute because what does he say? This is only Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Now, who's speaking? Rabbi Yochanan. Now, if you had to think of someone who was a big Torah scholar, Rabbi Yochanan would be up there. What does he say? That's those people, about kigon anu, but us, lowly people, who are just regular people. And this is Rabbi Yochanan says, mafsikin l'kriyat shema u'letfilah. We do everything as normal. We stop for everything else. Our learning is not that important that we're not on the same level as Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So now they say, wait a minute. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita, kashem she'em mafsikin l'tfilah, kach em mafsikin l'kriyat shema? But doesn't it say, just like we don't stop for prayer, we also don't stop for kriyat shema? So how do we say that you do stop for kriyat shema? So what do they answer? You took something out of context. You took that statement from somewhere else. You misunderstood. Kitana ha'ibi ibor shana. That was when they were dealing with deciding, do they need to add an extra month to the year? Which was a very big decision they had to make, and they had to do all sorts of calculations. Now, when you have to do all sorts of calculations, you need to really focus. So when they were doing Ibor Shana, in fact, they didn't stop for anything, okay? That's a unique exception. So we had an exception to the rule of unique people, and now we have an exception to the rule of a unique situation where you're doing Ibor Shana. Da'amar Rav Adabar Abba, v'chein tanis sabi de hagronya. Rav Adabar Abba said this, and the Braita, it was taught by the elders of Hagronia in a Braita. And as they quoted a Braita, Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Kshayinu oskim be'ibor shana b'yavne, lo hayinu mafsikim, lo l'kriyat shema, v'lo l'tfilah. We didn't stop for anything. Okay? So we see that in certain circumstances, you have to stop for kriyat shema, but not for tfilah. And in certain circumstances, you don't have to stop at all, not for any of these things. And I want to just bring up some other sources that talk about this. Okay, there's a few more sources that discuss this. The Tosefta Masechet Shabbat says, "Kashem mafsikin l'kriyat shema," just like you have to stop for kriyat shema. Kach mafsikin l'kriyat megillah, or l'kriyat halel, or l'tkiyat shofar, or l'tinat lulav, or l'kol mitzvot hamorot b'Torah. So from the Tosefta, it seems very clear, and this is the answer we gave when we learned our Mishnah. In case it wasn't clear, what's the distinction between kriyat shema and tefillah? Kriyat shema is a mitzvah midoraita. And tefillah, as we said before, yes, tefillah is a mitzvah midoraita, but not set prayer times. That's not midoraita, and therefore, as long as you pray once a day, according to the Rambam or the Ramban, not even, then you're within the mitzvah doraita, and that's why if you're in the middle of doing these things, you don't actually have to stop to pray. The Yerushalmi, though, brings up a few different explanations. In the Yerushalmi, one answer is Dvar Torah and not Dvar Torah. A second answer given is Kriyat Shema Zmana Kavua, Tefillah Ein Zmana Kavua. That, again, this is in the world of theory, but the Tefillah doesn't have a set time, and Kriyat Shema does. And Rabbi Yossi says, a very interesting one, Kriyat Shema Einat Tzricha Kavana, and Tefillah Tzricha Kavana. Because Tefillah needs Kavana, so if you're in the middle of something, imagine you're in the middle of something and you stop to daven, you're not exactly focusing on your prayer so well. So therefore, he says, Kriyat Shema, you don't need kavanah. For tefillah, you need kavanah, and you're not going to be able to have the proper focus if you're in the middle of doing something and you stop to daven and then you go back to it, right? Your mind is still kind of, we all know this. We often stop in the middle of something. We realize, oh, it's time to daven. We didn't daven, we stop, and then we go back to it. You're not so focused. So because Kriyat Shema doesn't really need that same focus as tefillah does, therefore, and that shows the opposite approach, because first it sounded like Kriyat Shema is more stringent, and that's why. But here it sounds like Kriyat Shema is actually less stringent, and that's why you can actually daven. We had this before with the Umanim B'Rosh HaIlan, if you remember. The people in the trees, we had it in Brachot, that they could say Kriyat Shema in the middle of the tree, whereas you couldn't say Amidah there. And again, there were different explanations, but one was because you can't focus properly when you're in a tree, but for Shema, you don't need the same focus. Okay, so the same answers are given here. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. Lo yetzeh hachayat b'machato samuch l'chashecha. Remember we said the previous Mishnah, we didn't really understand what it's doing here because it was talking about things before Mincha, but it wasn't actually talking about things relating to Shabbat. But now we move to things toward the end of the day, samuch l'chashecha, before it gets dark, that you're not allowed to do, because what are we worried? That you might do something on Shabbat. So even before Shabbat starts, you already can't do them. So what would that be? Lo yetzeh hachayat b'machato. If you're a tailor, you can't walk around carrying your needles close to dark. Shema yishkach v'yetzeh. We're worried that you might keep them on you. You might be still carrying them when Shabbat comes in. Below halablar b'kul maso, and the sofer, the person, the scribe, can't walk around with his quill. Also, before it gets dark, because he might end up writing. He might end up carrying it when it's Shabbat. But now we talk about some other things that don't really seem connected to what we're talking about. Below yaflet kelav, another thing. Now, the other things that we're going to see in this Mishnah seem to be not related to right before Shabbat, but they seem to be related to not being able to do particular things because something might go wrong. Okay, lo yaflet kelav, you can't clean off your clothes from lice. Okay, you can't pick them off, the lice bugs out of your clothes. This is actually a different issue. Below yikra la'or haner, and you can't read by candlelight. Why can't you read by candlelight? We're worried that if the candle starts flickering, you're going to fix it, and that you're going to do on Shabbat. Here we're not talking about before Shabbat, we're talking about on Shabbat. But here's an interesting one. Be'emet amru, hachazam ro'eh hechan tinokot korin, aval hu lo yikra. The chazan can look at where the children are reading from, but he himself can't read. Okay, so what does this have to do with the children, and what's he doing? So a bunch of different interpretations whenever there's something that's not clear. And again, this is based on the reality of the day, and we don't really know the reality of the day, and they didn't really know either. So Rashi says you can't read by a book. So he says the Chazan. Who is this? The Chazan at Knesset. Hamakre Shiv'at HaKor'im B'Torah. He's the one in charge of Kriyat Torah. Now, this is a very interesting parsha because he says, Pa'amim she'eno yodeh hechan tzrichim likrot lemachar. Sometimes he doesn't know what parsha they're up to. So what does he do? V'ro'eh hechan korin tinokot shabei rabban b'Shabbat. So all the kids know what parsha it is. He might not know, so he checks with the kids so we can go look at what they're up to, where he's not really reading. He's just looking where are they up to in their parsha shir, and then he knows. Now, this is a very strange interpretation. How is it the kids know, he doesn't know? It's very strange. The Rishonim says something very interesting. They say that the children, what it really means is he can kind of see what the children are up to, but they themselves can actually read, but he can't read. Now, why can the children read? Well, if you're reading and you like reading, so you're going to read, and if the light starts flickering, you'll try to fix it. But children in school don't actually love learning, right? If the light starts flickering, they'll say, we don't have to learn now, so let's just, light starts flickering. They're not going to fix it. And that's why the Tinokot can read, but the adults can't. Okay. Then the Mishnah finishes up with something totally unrelated. If you thought that these other things weren't so connected, Lo yochal hazav im hazava mipnei hergel avera. Okay, a few concepts here. A zav is someone who has a discharge, a man, and it's not a bloody discharge, it's a clear discharge. If he sees 2 times usually within the same day, then he's considered a zav. And then he becomes impure. But if he sees 3 times, he becomes a full-fledged zav. This is going to be important for later in the daf. That's why I'm giving you all these details that maybe seem unnecessary right now. But keep this in mind. Once he sees 3 times, then he is considered a zav gadol, and then he needs to do bring a sacrifice, and then he has to wait 7 clean days. So 2 re'iyot he doesn't, but 3 he already does. Okay, that's a zav. A zava is a woman who sees for 3 days, and then she sees when it's not her regular period and it's blood. It's not a clear discharge like by the man. And nowadays we treat all women as zava gedola, and that's why, all women who bleed, and that's why they have to wait 7 clean days. So they're not allowed, a husband and wife can't be together when she's a zava. So it says here, the zav can't eat with the zava when she's a zava, mipnei hergel avera, so that they don't end up coming to sleep together, because that's forbidden. Okay, so basically you should try to keep somewhat separated. The Rashi points out it's not just a zav. It's a little strange that they use the lashon of a zav. It would be really anybody. Okay, Tnan Hatam. The Mishnah says, Lo ya'amod adam b'reshut hayachid v'yishteh b'reshut harabim. Okay, so now when we're talking about things that you shouldn't do just in case something else might happen, so they bring up another case. The reason why they're bringing this is because eventually they're going to bring our Mishnah to question one of the opinions. So they first quote this Mishnah in Eruvin. You can't stand in a private domain and drink from a public domain. Or b'reshut harabim v'yishteh b'reshut hayachid. Basically, you can't be in one domain and also be in a different domain drinking from there. Aval. However, because what's the concern? If you're standing in one domain and you're drinking in the other, you might bring the water into the other domain. And then you'll be chayav for passing something from one domain to the other. Aval im yechnis rosho v'robo lemakom shu shoteh. If he moves his head and the majority of his body into the place where he's drinking, then it's mutar. Okay, then already he's allowed. So now, and then it says in the Mishnah, v'chein begat, and the same thing would be in the wine press. Okay, this is strange. What does a wine press have to do with anything? We're going to get there. So now a question was asked about this Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about Reshut Harabim and Reshut Yachid, private, public. So now it says, Carmelit Mai. What about a Carmelit? What if it's this in-between space? The whole concern is, right, that we're worried if you're standing in one domain and you're drinking in the other domain, you might come to move it. But what if that domain is only forbidden by the rabbis, like the Carmelit, this in-between domain? So what's the halacha? Amar Abaye, he says, that's what the God is. The wine press is a Carmelit. And because the wine press is a Carmelit, and the Mishnah says, v'chein begat, that means that the same laws apply even in a Carmelit. Rabbah is very disturbed by this. Rabbah says, Amar, he gufa gzera, va'ana nikam v'nigzor gzera l'gzera. We have this principle that when the rabbis institutes, right, the whole reason why we're doing this is because we're worried. There's nothing actually wrong with you putting your head from one domain into the other domain and drinking in that domain. The whole concern is that maybe you're going to move it into a different domain. However, if the issue is, if it's private to public, then we understand that's d'oraita. But if the rabbis forbade a Carmelit so that you don't accidentally, since a Carmelit might be confused with Reshut Rabim, you might accidentally carry from a private to a public if we allow the Carmelit. That's all Xerah of the rabbis. They instituted this just in case. So now we're instituting a just in case on a just in case. That doesn't make any sense. So therefore, we say, Rava says there's no way that a Carmelit is problematic. So now, Amar Abai, Mina Aminala. So now each one is going to say, where do I get my opinion from? And as Rava's opinion was pretty clear, but the question is, where did Abai get his opinion from? So he says, Dekatane, as it says in the Mishnah there, B'chein begat. Now, my gat, what is a gat? What kind of domain is a gat in? Tanina. If you say it's private, well, it already said private in the Mishnah. And if it's public, Tanina. If we view it as public, it already talked about public in the Mishnah. If we viewed it as private, it already said private in the Mishnah. So it must be, if the Mishnah is telling you that there's another case that we didn't mention, it must be a Carmelit. So Rava Amar, B'chein begat linya maser. Rava says, no, you misunderstood that line, B'chein begat. B'chein begat didn't mean the same rules apply in the gat in terms of carrying. No. The same rules apply in a gat in terms of laws of masrot. Okay, the Trumot masrot, when they took the parts of the vegetables or the fruits that they gave, or the grains that they gave to the priests and to the Levites. So the same rules apply for a gat. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Why do you need to know domains when it comes to this? So in order to understand this, you need basic laws of when those laws kick in. They kick in usually when you finish the finished product and you bring it into your house. So if you're eating in the fields, there's no problem. You don't have to take the Trumot Masrot. However, the rabbi said, if you already remove it from the wine press area, now let's say you make wine and you take some wine and you move it somewhere else. If you're in the fields, the only way the rabbis instituted that you're responsible is if you're eating like a meal. It's a more formal type of eating. Or also they said if you move it away from the wine press, that's already considered that you're not just, right, imagine you're picking fruits and you just pick a fruit off the tree and eat it, right? This happens when you go fruit picking. You often just take a fruit and eat it. Now that's not a meal, you're in the middle of picking. So likewise, if you're in the gat, you're in the wine press, you're working, you're not really eating a meal. But if you move to a different area, then already you're going to be, that's already, the rabbi said, that's already a problem. So now the question is, this is why it's important, when are you considered begat and when are you not? Let's say your head, you're in the gat, but your head is away from the gat, right? All the distinctions made in the Mishnah between if rosho v'rubo, right? Let's say the majority of your body's there, but you're eating outside the gat. So how do we view that? Well, the laws are the same for the gat when it comes to Trumot Maschot. So let's just read this inside. Rav Amar b'chein begat le'inyam maser. V'chein Amar Rav Sheshet v'chein begat le'inyam maser. Not just Rav said this, Rav Sheshet also said this. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. Shotin alagat, bein al hachamim, bein al atzonim. We're now going to see a three-way machloket about how you can drink this wine. Now, people didn't drink wine undiluted. So if we're talking, it's not the same as picking a fruit. When you go to drink wine, when you're in the wine press, you must be diluting it. Now, once you dilute it, theoretically, we could be saying that once you're diluting it, it's already going to be more like what we call a chilat keva. Because if you're already taking the time, it's not like just eating a fruit, you're picking grapes, so you pop some grapes in your mouth. But if you start diluting the wine, that already sounds more serious. So now we're going to have a three-way debate about this diluting the wine. So they say here, so you can drink in the gat whether you use hot water or whether you use cold water to dilute, upatur, okay? And you're exempt from the Trumot Maschot. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok mechayev. He says you're actually chayav, okay? He says once you dilute the wine, that's already considered that you're taking this meal seriously. The Chachamim omrim, al hachamin, right? If we have three opinions, you can already imagine where this one's going. Al hachamin chayav, al atzoneim patur. It depends whether you dilute it with hot water or cold water. The assumption is if you dilute it with hot water, you're going to be drinking this wine. And if you have extra, you're not going to pour it back into the wine press. But al hatzonein, if you mix it with cold water, then theoretically you might end up, if you have extra left, you might throw it back into the wine press. Okay, hopefully you don't have corona because you'll be sharing your germs with everybody. They didn't seem too germ concerned here. But if you're chayava, if you do it on hatzonein, then you're patur, because the assumption is if you're near the gat, you might actually dump the extra back into the gat. That's what it says. They will dump back the extra in. Okay? So now, there's two ways to understand this v'chein begat. How does this compare to the earlier case? In what way? So some say it's that we're more lenient, and some say it's that we're less lenient. How so? So one opinion is to say v'chein begat means that if you're standing not right next to the gat, but you move the majority, rosho v'rubo, your head and the majority of your body toward the gat, we can consider it that you're near the gat and the laws of gat will apply. Or some people say no, that you can't drink the wine near the gat because what are we worried about? Just like in Shabbat, you might take it into a different domain. So likewise here, we're worried you might actually move your body, right? End up drinking the wine a little bit away from the gat, and then you'll already be chayav in the Trumot Maslo. Okay? So now, that was all to tell us that Rava thinks that the gat has nothing to do with a karmelit, has nothing to do with Rishuyot of Shabbat. It has to do with this other issue. And that's why he can't prove it from here what Abai is trying to say. Okay, now we're going to move on and try to bring some questions against Rav. Tnan. Okay, and now we get to our Mishnah. Lo yetze hachayat b'machato samuch lechashecha shema ishkach v'yetze. So what did we say? You can't walk out with your needle if you're a tailor near dark because maybe you'll forget. My lab. Now, what did Rava say? Remember what Rava said. You can't make a gzera on a gzera, okay? If it's already, right, if something's forbidden midrabanan, we don't make it all the more so, right? We don't make any gzera on that. Well, when a chayat goes out with his needle, okay, something that's interesting about this is that when the chayat goes out with his needle, it's not actually asur midoraita. And then we're going to say, well, since he goes out with his needle and it's not asur midoraita, why should we forbid it before Shabbat? Shema he'll come to do it on Shabbat. Isn't that gzera l'gzera? So what's the reason? They say because it's tchuvalo b'bigdo. How does a tailor wear his needle? Right? We've gone to tailors before. They always stick their needles on their clothes. Now that's not a normal way of wearing, of taking something out. When you take something out from reshut to reshut, you carry it in your hand. He sticks it in his clothes. That's not a typical manner, and therefore it's not actually hotza amido raita. Okay? So, therefore, why would we forbid it, right? My lav ditchuvalo bibigdo, in which case it's not actually asur midoraita, in which case we shouldn't forbid it also on Erev Shabbat in case he comes to do it on Shabbat, if Shabbat is only derabanan. So what do you see against Rava? That we actually do make a gzera ala gzera. So the Gemara answers, lo, Tanya, lo dinakit le biyadin. No, we can say he's actually holding it in his hand, and that's what the Mishnah is talking about. Well, now they bring another source. Okay, now our Mishnah was very unclear. It just said, don't go out with your needle. But there's a Braita where it's actually more clear. Tashma, lo yetze hachayat b'machato hatchuva lo b'bigdo. It says you can't go out with your needle that's stuck in your clothes. Now, my lab. Now, what doesn't it say there, though? It doesn't say when. Maybe it's talking about there, not on Erev Shabbat. So the Gemara first says, my lab be'erev Shabbat. Isn't it just like our Mishnah? And it must be talking about Erev Shabbat. So they say, lo, kitanyayi b'Shabbat. No, that Braita that said don't go out with it in your clothing was talking about b'Shabbat because it's asur midrabanan. But it's not asur before Shabbat because it's only a derabanan. Our Mishnah must have been talking about when it's actually in your hand. But now they bring a Braita which says both Erev Shabbat and tchuvalo b'bigdo. So what does it say now? V'hatanya lo yetzeh chayat b'machato tchuvalo b'bigdo be'erev Shabbat im chashecha. Now we have a source that says it all. It says you can't go on Erev Shabbat and you can't go out with it in your clothes. This really seems to go against Rava because Rava says, right, that's a gzera l'gzera. It's right. It's only asur midrabanan to walk out with it on your clothes, and it's only asur midrabanan to do it on Erev Shabbat, right? Because maybe you'll do it on Shabbat. So how does the Gemara answer this? Hamane Rabbi Yehudahi. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda has a subjective approach to things. It's a very interesting law. Tamar uman derech umanu tochaya. If you or I would walk out, I'm assuming you're not a tailor. If you or I would walk out with a needle in our clothing, that's not a normal way we walk out. We wouldn't be obligated on Shabbat. But if you're a tailor and you walk out the way you normally walk around, then you're obligated. That's subjective. So there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about this halacha. So we're basically going to say the Braita that said that it's asur to do it on Erev Shabbat if it's in your clothes must be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, because only Rabbi Yehuda thinks that that's usher for him midoraita, and therefore you can't do it on Erev Shabbat, just in case you do the doraita on Shabbat. But for someone like us, it wouldn't be a problem. So, Ditanya, lo yetzeh chayap b'machato, lo yetzeh chayap b'machato atzkuva lo bebigdo v'lo nagar b'kesam shabos. No, we're now going to have all different occupations and the implements that they would use and how they would carry them. Okay, this teaches you a little bit of the reality at the time. So, the carpenter can't go out with his ruler stuck in his ear, right? We always stick things on your ears. Here, I have a video I can show you, right? Stick the pen on my ear. So that's how he would hold his it seems like it's some type of ruler. Below sorek b'mishicha shabos. No, the sorek is the person who combs out the wool, not with the mishicha in his ear. Okay, this is also something he would use for his. I didn't get it. I think they tie up their wool they wind it up. So with some implement. Below garde be'ira shabos. No, the embroiderer, not within he uses a certain tool to basically weave. So not with the tool that he uses for weaving in his ear. The dyer, he has different samples, like the same way we have the samples of the the paint samples. So he walks around with wool that's dyed to show people, oh, this color, that color. He walks around with it on his neck. Below shulchani b'dinar shabos. No, he keeps, I don't know how he does this exactly, the money in his ear. Okay, he's the money changer. So he walks around with money. So all these people, according to the Braita, can't walk out that way. But if they did, well, it's only Asher Midrabanan, because normal people don't walk around like this. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Uman derech umanuto chayav ushar kol adam patur. But Rabbi Yehuda says, if that's your job, then you are chayav midoraita, but everybody else will be patur. So again, he has a subjective approach. It depends who you are and how you're carrying it. So the law is different for different people. You could see why, on the one hand, this would make sense. On the other hand, it's a little dangerous to start making different laws for different people. Okay, Tanichad. So then now again, that helped us resolve the Braita that we brought against Rava to say this seems to disagree with Rava because it's only midrabanan. We now say, oh no, according to this, it's actually d'oraita. Okay, Tanichad. One Braita says, lo yetze, now we're bringing a contradiction between two Braitot. Lo yetze azav b'kiso ve'im yatsa patur aval asur. V'tanya idach lo yatsa ve'im yatsa chayav chatat. Why are we bringing this? Because this is going to be connected, we think, at least in the beginning, to the Machloka Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So a Zav can't go out wearing a pouch around his private parts to protect. Okay, so now the question is going to be why he's doing this. Okay, he wears this. It's kind of like a pad for a woman. That's the most, right? Or a tampon. Okay, you can't walk out with this. Now, this is interesting. Normally, you don't walk around with a keys there in your private parts. So it's not the actual typical way of doing things. So that's why it's very similar to this. But for the Zav, this is what he does. This is how he wears it. So for him, it's normal. For other people, it's not normal. So he can't do this, but if he did it, patur aval asur, right? It's only asur midrabanan. According to the other Braita, it's asur midoraita. So how do we explain this? Rav Yosef lo kashya ha Rabbi Meir ha Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Meir, it's going to be patur aval asur because it's not a typical way that people do things. According to Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't matter. For the Zav, this is typical. He's going to be chayav. So now they said, no, this isn't connected because Amar le Abaye imor deshamat le Rabbi Meir b'midi delav hainu orche. Rabbi Meir said he was talking about something that it's not a typical way of doing it for anybody, but b'midi dehainu, or just for a unique person. But this pouch was actually, and I'll stick with a pad because it's easier for us to understand. A pad is meant to be worn like that. Now, even though most people don't use it on a normal basis, assuming they don't have their period, therefore, it is a typical way of wearing that pad, though. So it is a typical way. So if it's not normally its way of doing it, but b'midi behind orche mishamatle, but Rabbi Meir wasn't talking about when it is the typical way. So now we're stuck with saying, really, everyone would say it's chayav midoraita. So why do we have this debate? And he brings up an interesting proof, which I have to say it's not totally parallel. But he says, if you say that Rabbi Meir says that if not everybody does this, or you're not the specialist who does this, you're not going to be chayav. So he says, if you don't say that, basically he's going to say, it sounds like what you're saying is every specialist who does something is going to be chayav for being a specialist. But if you take Rabbi Meir farther, you're going to get to that if I'm a regular person and I make a hole in a piece of wood, some people say it's to make like a prosthetic leg. So if I make a hole in this piece of wood to make a prosthetic leg, since I'm not an expert and I don't do it the way the experts do it, I'm going to be patur, midoraita. That doesn't make any sense. So therefore, he says, when things are done in the normal way, so it's true, I'm not doing it exactly the way the specialist would do it, but I'm doing the same thing. So therefore, you're going to be chayav midoraita, even according to Rabbi Meir. And therefore, you can't say that the zav who walks out with this kiss is only chayav midorabanan, according to Rabbi Meir. So now we're stuck with, why does one of the brightot say it's only asur midorabanan? So Elam Rav Hamnuna lo kasha, kam bezav bal shtei reiyot, kam bezav bal shalosh reiyot. Who normally wears this pouch? A zav who saw twice. Why? He wears it so that he can check if he sees a third time. The pouch is there to check what is going on. Is he having a third reiyah? And that he needs it because he needs to know if he becomes a zav midoraita. But a zav that only saw twice, a zav that saw 3 times already, and anyways, a zav doesn't need the pouch to be able to check. So that's the difference. Now the Gemara says that doesn't work either. Zav bal shtei reiyot chayav demibayle b'dika, zav bal shalosh reiyot nami mibayle l'sfira. The reason he's not chayav, you're saying, is because he needs to check. But the guy who saw 3 times also needs to check. Why? Because if you remember, what did I say? He needs 7 clean days. If he needs 7 clean days, he needs to check if those days are clean. So therefore, he's wearing it also for a purpose. So they say, lo nitzracha ela labo b'yom. We're talking about when he saw the third riyah, he's still in that day, he doesn't need Sheva Nakim. The Sheva Nakim start the next day. So he's only midorabanan when he's wearing this pouch, when we've now narrowed the case into a very narrow case, which is he's seen 3 times in one day, and he therefore doesn't need the pouch to check for anything. Okay, so now the Gemara says, what do you mean? What does he need it for? If we go back to our pad analogy, why do women wear pads? Her tampons. But isn't he wearing it so that his clothes don't get dirty? So he does need it, and it is a typical way of wearing it. We're going to end here for today, or I'll just end with this next line, and then we'll get to the proof of it tomorrow. Amar Rabbi Zera, Hai Tana Huda Amar, Kol Itzule Tinuf Lo Kach Hashiv. This must be going according to the Tana who holds that anything that's used to basically protect you from getting dirty is not considered anything, basically. In other words, right, if you're wearing a pad just so that your clothes don't get dirty and you're carrying it out, right, that's not considered carrying for the purposes of carrying. This is what we call also malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. You're not carrying it out because you need it. You're carrying it out because you don't want your clothes to get dirty. So it's something used for not its atypical purposes, and we're going to start tomorrow with figuring out how we know that, who's the Tana who says this, and in fact, it's going to be in a totally different context that they say this, about the concept of hachshara lekabel tum'ah, which is when something becomes susceptible to accepting tum'ah. Okay, that's it for today.